Today we're going to explore organizational development. How do you get these large organizations, corporations, to change? It has to be something akin to stopping a supertanker. You have to plan far, far ahead. What are the actual steps in the process of getting change in an organization? How well does it work? And how ethical is it to impose change on people who may not want to change? All of these comprise the topics under organizational development, which has been shortened to OD. First of all, what is organizational development? If we go to the first of the overheads, coming up, yes. It is the application of social science techniques to plan change in organizational settings for the purpose of enhancing organizational effectiveness and the development of individuals. Underneath that, there are some philosophical assumptions which we need to take a look at. What are the underlying values for organizational development? They center around 4 issues. The first is the concept of people. How are people viewed from perspective of organizational development? The conception, the perspective is a humanistic view of individuals. And what this means is the view is that humans are basically healthy individuals who are self-motivated, who move from dependence in terms of personal growth to independence, who move from simple behaviors to more complex behaviors, who move from passivity to activity, who move from looking at short-term goals to taking a long-term perspective, and who move from a lack of self-awareness to awareness, to self-control. And so generally the image is of somebody who has the capacity for personal growth. Very positive image of people, of all people, underlying organizational development. If the image or the concept were otherwise, that basically people are fixed and rigid and can't grow, then there's no point to organizational development. And so you see the need to have this as one of the underlying assumptions. A second assumption is the concern for science, because organizational development is the application of methods and techniques and principles from social sciences and behavioral science to bring about change in the organization. So there is an insistence on objective evidence as opposed to intuitively derived ideas. And there is an emphasis, and I should underscore that, there is a presumed emphasis on evaluation of the various interventions that are used to validate whether, in fact, they've actually worked. Are we getting what we profess we're going to get? A third underlying assumption is that of democratic principles. What does democracy have to do with science? Well, in this sense, the emphasis is on the involvement of individuals in handling their own affairs. That responsible involvement fosters setting your own goals. And if we think about what democracy is, democracy working properly demands responsible involvement. So it really goes hand in hand with the concept of people. That participation in making decisions that affect your own life foster a sense of control about your own life. And finally, there's the notion that people should have the power to change their own lives and things that affect their own lives. So if you think about what we've been talking about, this responsible involvement, this ability to change what affects your life, we're really talking about notions that we discussed much earlier in the semester when we talked about locus of control and that sense of internal locus of control, that perspective that you do control your own destiny and the outcomes and the things that happen to you. And the other thing it links up to is that high sense of self-efficacy, the perception of your own ability and your own capabilities. And finally, the last of these principles is the helping relationship. And this speaks to the responsibility of the organizational development practitioner, professional, and I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, in the helping relationship. The OD practitioner assists the client being the organization, to work out solutions for themselves. For the OD practitioner to go in and say, this is what you've got to do, without getting buy-in from the organization, is a fruitless kind of thing. It's absolutely wasting money, flushing it down the drain. That doesn't work. But the practitioner also needs to be aware of, in working with various clients, of differences between the clients, in different styles of communication, in different reasons for seeking assistance, and the various contingencies, the various environmental demands and organizational demands, which might mean that you can't plan organizational development in an organization by using something that was previously used. You really have to tailor whatever the program is to the organization. You may have a format, but it needs the specific tailoring, because if you use something off the shelf, it's going to miss the various different needs of individuals in that organization. So, does this conflict with, in any way, the realities and the practicalities of trying to run an organization? Well, first, potential conflict. Does it conflict with profit making? You have to sink a lot of money into this. It calls for a lot of resources. Is it worth the cost? And how do you know the cost is going to pay off? And are the people who you're involving in this decision making, if it's going to work the way we say it should work, following the various values, are these people going to have enough knowledge to make decent suggestions about what needs to be done? So is there a conflict now between doing OD and the need to make a profit in an organization? Well, let's look at it from another perspective. What's the cost of doing nothing? When an organization goes to a consultant or has a group inside which are internal consultants, they go for one of two reasons. Because they're hurting already, something is wrong somewhere, falling profits, rising costs, loss of market share, high turnover, problems in filling jobs, something is wrong. Or because they're looking downstream, they're looking ahead and saying, if we're going to remain competitive, we better plan on making the changes now, because we see where some of the other organizations are going. Or we want to get there before the other organizations get there, because this is what's happening in the field. So they're seeking help because they believe they need help. And you look at the investment in organizational development versus, as we say, the cost of doing nothing. If you're already losing money and doing nothing portends that you're going to continue losing money, then clearly it's worth the investment. You've got to try something if you want to remain alive. Of course, you could always shutter up the windows, nail close the doors, and say, that's it, we're out of business. That usually happens to organizations that don't look at the future. So the answer is, it's not really contrary to making profits. Yes, an investment, but organizations invest in technology all the time and don't see the payoff until somewhere later. It takes a while to see payoff from investments. The need to invest. The other question is it a conflict with managerial prerogative? Who knows best in all of this? And now we turn to things that we've talked about before during the semester, which is participatory style of leadership and participatory style in decision making. Clearly, we looked at the benefits of those previously. The notion that people closest to the problem often have the best information about the problem. Don't be afraid to go to them. They do have something to offer. Does it change managerial style? Sure, but managerial style is changing anyway. It's going to change in part because technology forces that change. And one of the things that we touched on maybe briefly when we talked about leadership, but the change that's surely coming about, forced by technology, is really doing remote managing. Managing from a distance. So not only do we have learning from a distance, but we're going to move to, and we already have on-site managing from a distance. It calls for a different style, and clearly it calls for more trust in employees. It calls for releasing the old command and control style. And it calls for looking at results, not looking at surrogates for work, walking around, or what some have called peekaboo management. I see you, therefore I think you're working. But really looking at results and outcomes. And that's where all of this is taking us anyway. So sure, there's going to have to be a switch in management as you move to these sorts of things, but better now and better for the company. So changes occur in organizations, and they have widespread ramifications. The process of organizational development, we've been dancing around the edges of it, but what is it? The first thing that I want to remind you about as we talk about this is the open systems model. 3 lectures ago, session 22 for reference. This is the basic model that's used in diagnosing organizations. And remember, the model is one of inputs, transformations, and outputs. The model is useful because it sensitizes anybody who's doing work in the area to the impact of the environment. There are things out there which have an effect on the organization that aren't happening internally to the organization. And it also allows you to look at a concept which is very important in organizational development, the concept of alignment, making sure that the various subsystems of the organization are working together and not working in contradiction to each other. So that if you install a new technology, as an example, you want to make sure that you have redesigned jobs to accompany the technology, and you want to make sure that you've made appropriate changes in the human resource systems to support the changes that have gone on in the technology, system alignment. Having said that, let's take a look at steps of diagnosis, and we're going to work through 3 different levels. The highest level is that of the organizational level diagnosis. This is the level that you would use when you're thinking about a strategic change, a really, really big change, something that will redirect the efforts of the organization. What are the inputs that you need to be concerned about with this? Well, first, general environment, the things that we talked about, lecture 22. General economy, legal political situation, social cultural, technology, those kinds of factors. How is that affecting the organization. And so you need to do essentially the environmental scan and the environmental diagnosis so you understand what kind of impact that's going to have on the organization. The second thing that you have to take a look at, the second input into all of this, is taking a look at the industry structure. Now you start benchmarking yourself against other industries. So it takes some homework as you do this diagnosis. You're in the computer industry. What's happening with the big guys? What's happening with Hewlett-Packard? What's happening with IBM? What's happening globally outside the US? What's happening with Toshiba? And some of the others that are out there. And then you see where you are in comparison to these organizations. Remember, there's a lot of information available there. All of these companies have to do yearly filings with the SEC, because we're talking about public companies, companies that are here, plus other industry-wide reports that become available. So that's the input level. At the transformation level, what do you then need to take a look at as you're doing a diagnosis? You need to take a look at what is the current strategy of the organization, what is the organizational design, and here there are a number of factors that fit into it, because I'm not just talking about the literal structure of the organization. It also includes human resource systems, as an example. It also includes measurement systems, and it also includes core business processes. What is the technology? What's the basic thing this organization is about? And you look to see, all right, does this fit well with whatever the strategy is? The alignment. Okay, and finally, organizational culture. Does that fit well with the strategy? Alignment. Okay, and then we go to outputs. What are the outputs at the organizational level? Organizational performance. Toss into this all of the financial ratios that you can think of. And then you can do comparisons. And toss into it productivity measures. And organizations know how they're doing in productivity. Those are things that are reported. They need to check on those things themselves. And then finally, something called stakeholder satisfaction. Who are the important people out there and how satisfied are they with the organization? Of course, the customer's primary one, but also, if it's a publicly traded company, the stockholders, and the employees, an important constituent in that organization. So you check with the major important constituents to see how satisfied they are as yet another outcome of the organization. Okay. These things are going to be good if things are aligned, strategy is right, things are going well, and they're going to be misaligned if things are going poorly. You're going to find out in relation to other organizations, performance is off, productivity is off, satisfaction is down. Okay, key indicators to look at that top level, and the need then to go in and say, okay, we want to make this kind of change. We're going to move into this market, we're going to change the way we do our technology, whatever it is. We think this is the appropriate change to make. You benchmark what your performance is. That means that after you make the change later, you can come back and do a measurement and see if it's worked. Important thing to do. Okay, but as you put the changes in at an organizational level, make sure you bring culture into line with the new change in technology. Make sure you bring human resource systems into line with the new change in technology, if you're changing the way you're using technology in the organization. But you may want to make a change at another level of the organization, the group level. What is the input at this point? Everything that we talked about in the organization design factors, basically everything that was in the transformation box at the organizational level moves down to the input box at the group level. And what are the transformation factors here? Basically, group design factors. What counts as a group design factor? Task structure, team functioning, goal clarity, role clarity, group composition, who's making up the group, and the group norms. All of these fit in. And you look to see whether these align together, whether the norms support the team functioning, whether goal clarity supports the task structure. Things that you're working at as you're trying to analyze what's going wrong with this organization at the group level, because that's where you ascertain there's some kind of problem. And what are the outputs? What's going to indicate to you in the first place that there's a problem? Well, team effectiveness. Is this group producing the way they should be producing? Are the decisions of quality in all of this? And satisfaction. Are the team members getting along with each other? And are people relatively satisfied in terms of what they're doing? Again, looking for alignment of things if there are problems at the group level. And then finally, at the lowest level, individual level diagnosis. What's going on here? All of the group design factors move down. Everything that we talked about in the transformation box at the group level becomes an input at the individual level, as well as personal characteristics, those things that we have mentioned all semester long we can't avoid in doing diagnosis. Knowledge, skills, ability, attitudes fit in as an input at the individual level. What's the transformation? At this point, we take a look basically at the job design. We're looking at the person in relation to the task that the person is doing and seeing whether those things fit. And the factors that fit in there go back to Hackman and Lawler's notions of job redesign, if you remember the various things that fit in there. Skill variety, task significance, autonomy, feedback, task identity. All of those factors are the sub-factors of the job design. And you look to see how well those are doing, and then you look at individual outputs, individual effectiveness. What accounts for individual effectiveness? Again, productivity, and again, satisfaction. So it moves, all of these things move down to the individual level, and you look to see what is going on. And there are things that you could say, well, things detract from productivity that feed into that. So productivity is this global terminology. But what are the things that then detract from productivity? You might toss in accident rates are going up. Suggests that there is a problem somewhere along the line. Does it mean that there is not a good program in safety? Does it mean that there's not an accident reduction campaign that goes on, as an example? And what do you need to do to reduce this sort of thing? Because, as they say in work, time is money. And any time lost from the job due to accidents cuts down on performance and productivity. Okay, so different ways of diagnosing. And the consultants then come in and spend a lot of time interviewing people at different levels in the firm to get the big picture, and then go back and put all of their notes together using an open systems model to try to see where the discontinuities are. Often, the practitioner who's brought in, the consultant, and there's good reason to use an outside consultant because most firms are too small to have their own internal organizational development consultants. And the other reason for using the outside consultant is that person is not beholden to somebody in the organization for a job. In other words, you don't have an automatic conflict of interest built into the situation. So, reasons for using outside consultants. The consultant will find out that maybe the organization calls consultants in and says, well, gee, morale is low. We think we need like a little course for morale to boost everybody's morale here. And the consultants, if they're worth their weight, will say, that's what you might think the problem is, but if I'm going to take the job, I want to do my diagnosis of the situation. And they may find out that, in fact, the problem is more widespread than this little isolated thing that somebody may think is the problem. So diagnosis is done. Where do we go from here? After diagnosis, after you find out what the problem is, what to do. The next step is the diagnostic feedback session. You've got all this information. You have to now feed it back to the organization, and usually you start at the very top. The bad news goes to the people who paid for it. Okay. But that feedback session is also the session in which you find out whether the client is going to go for organizational development or not. Do they accept the information that you give them? You begin to point out what the problems are. And if the organization is buying into the notion that they need to do something, then they need to be open about hearing what the problems are and not defensive. It's at a very large scale the analogy of the performance appraisal feedback interview. Okay, but now you're giving a performance appraisal feedback interview to the CEO and saying, here's where your organization is missing in steps, and here's what we probably need to do in order to remedy this. And that information needs to diffuse through the organization. If it's done properly, it can't just stay with the people on top, but it needs to come down, as we think about it in cascade fashion. This is what we found. How do we now start building the process to remedy this? And you really do need buy-in, commitment from people top to bottom in the organization to help build the remedy, because those individuals know more about the organization than the consultant does. They're going to have to be the ones to help suggest and design what remedies are, with guidance from the consultant. The next step is that of choosing interventions. And here, the interventions that's selected is going to depend at what level is the problem. Is it a top-level strategic one? Is it a group-level one? Is it an individual one? And just very quickly, if you're talking about a top-level big one, and we'll go through some of the different ones, you may be talking about putting in a total quality management program or something in re-engineering, as an example. If you're talking group level, you're probably talking about team building, and if you're talking about an individual level, you're probably talking about some kind of individual training courses that are needed. It gives you an array of some of the interventions and remedies that can be selected. And finally, the last two steps are managing change and institutionalizing change. The intervention needs commitment, one more time, and I will probably say this more times than you choose to hear, but that's really the case, of top management. And as it's put in place, management then needs to, here's the investment from management, they need to commit resources, that's personnel and money, to putting up some kind of structure to oversee the intervention process. Who's in charge as we start to devise this program in re-engineering? And it's going to have to be personnel from the organization. So if they're going to be working on the intervention, then somebody has to do their job. You can't have somebody doing two jobs simultaneously. Okay, so that's the commitment of resources. It is a big investment as it goes through. And you're going to need to ultimately sustain the momentum. We've invested in this big change program. You need to sustain the momentum of it by institutionalizing the change. We want to make sure that it's not fleeting and it's not temporary. And it's not a momentary feel-good kind of thing. Let's have a big party, we're re-engineering. And so you need to make sure everything is in place. We'll go back to human resource systems so that you reinforce and reward the changed behavior. Too frequently, there are training programs, there are team building. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. People go off-site, they have a wonderful time, they come back, and it's business as usual, nothing's changed. Poor investment for an organization. You'd really want to see better payback than that. And so you need to be serious about what you're doing. The other reason to be serious about what you're doing in a change situation is you don't want to get into what we called last time a failed change situation. We go through change and then everybody becomes cynical about it. What's the point? Nobody is really serious about it. Okay, some major approaches to organizational development. Team building. Overhead? One of the most popular that goes on at this point, and in many of the courses that I teach at night at graduate level, where there are students who are already working, they have gone through team building exercises. What is it? It's the attempt to increase the team effectiveness by improving all of those processes that we discussed much earlier in the semester when we were talking about group processes. Communication, goal clarification, so people understand what the goals of the group are, role clarification, so people understand what their roles are in the group. And there is a task orientation to this. It becomes usually job-focused. Now, in the process of doing team building, it usually happens that the groups are taken off-site. The reason for taking them off-site to some location, training location, it could be a hotel, it could be some other situation, is to, one, get them away from the continual demands that they face in the workplace. If you try to do it on-site, even in some conference room, people are still in the environment of work, and the daily routine of work still impinges on them. I've got a coffee break, I'm going to go back and check my email. I've got a lunch break. I can run back and see how something else is doing and pick up all my voicemail and maybe get a memo off. And then they get back late to the training conference. Okay, so the reason for taking them away from the site is to get rid of those daily pressures from the job. The downside of that, of course, is it realistic? Are the activities that you go through off-site going to be taken back on the job? And something else that sometimes goes on in team building activities, where they do these kinds of things of building trust in people. How do you build trust? Well, you have to walk around blindfolded and let somebody lead you, or you fall backwards and trust somebody will catch you. But some of the more elaborate ones also bring people out into wilderness survival type camp situations, to do whitewater rafting, to do mountain climbing. Now this really sounds like it's great fun. And they're paying you for something like this? And what's the point of it all? The point of it is that if you can pull together in these very difficult situations, where in fact you have to, because unless you pull together in those kinds of situations, you know, you're mountain climbing and you depend on somebody who's above you and below you for the ropes, you're whitewater rafting and you depend on people pulling together, okay? It sort of makes that team effort and that need to trust and that depending on people extremely vivid to you. You can't get away from it. The question is, so what does this have to do with work? Answer is that presumably in that pulling together in that situation, you find a way to transfer that back to the job situation. And in the demands and the pressures of the job, you understand that you do have to trust individuals, you do have to communicate well with individuals to pull it off. particularly as jobs often get to periodically, that pressure cooker situation. When the transfer happens, it works well. But we will talk about evaluation, and we can see that sometimes it doesn't transfer back. It's seen as a couple days off from work, some fun activities, but go back to work and it's the same old job demands and nothing's changed. And the communication hasn't improved, and well, maybe the trust level has changed a little bit. But enough days on the job and we can get things back to the situation as usual. That's the danger of the investment, and that's where you need to have commitment. Team building is supposed to be an ongoing effort, not just 2 days away from the office. You need to come back and continue to work on it and make sure that the team members themselves are getting together and discussing and monitoring what's going on and identifying problems on their own. Okay. A second strategy that's used is survey feedback. This involves collecting questionnaires from employees and feeding the results back in a series of meetings. And the meetings are to formulate suggestions about the data and formulate ways to institute change. It is useful here to have managers conduct the feedback sessions in conjunction perhaps with the consultant who will help interpret what the data say. But the reason for doing that is to indicate clearly to employees that there is management buy-in and management commitment. I want to hear your suggestions. I want to hear about ways that we can turn around the problems that we've identified in the questionnaires. The plans that are developed have to be capable of being implemented so that it is incumbent upon employees not to create a pie-in-the-sky kind of plan. It has to be something that's going to be useful and worthwhile to the organization and handle the solution. The survey technique can be done throughout the entire organization, so it's at an organizational level. And implementation can be done in various parts of the organization where the problems are most prevalent. It's a popular type of technique because it's easy to do and it's flexible. You can collect a great deal of information very quickly. It all hinges on good interpretation of the meeting and good feedback sessions and sessions to formulate solutions. If surveys are done, no information is fed back to the group, and nothing ever happens after a while, there will be not much commitment on the part of employees to filling out the survey. Oh, here we go again. What's the point? Same questionnaire as last year? Nothing has changed. That gets to be discouraging, and people develop cynical attitudes. Another technique that's used is that of employee involvement. And here, 3 major types of employee involvement. Again, working more or less at a group level, although total quality management is usually throughout the organization. Quality of work life, historically, was the first of these. And it involved a number of changes coming about in the 60s at humanizing the workplace, making it just a nicer place to work, involving employees more, encouraging more democratic treatment of employees, doing more training, and redesigning work along the principles that we've talked about before so that there was job enlargement and job enrichment. One of the companies which embraced quality of work life changes was the General Motors plant at Tarrytown. That plant has recently closed. It's a plant that goes back decades and decades, and it just no longer became financially viable to operate that plant. But it's a plant that had problems in the 60s, instituted quality of work-life problems, and continued to be a productive organization up to the 90s. That was in contrast with another plant that had similar problems across the river from Tarrytown. It was the Ford plant at Mahwah. Some of you may remember that plant. It's since been leveled, and it's now an industrial city. But that plant did not institute quality of life programs. Problems persisted there, and the ultimate solution was to simply close the plant down. There was an enormous investment that had been made by Ford that was lost. I mean, ultimately, I guess the property was sold, but think about that huge amount of land there, and some of you may have remembered at times driving up Route 17 and seeing the weeds growing around the Ford plant that was there. So a popular technique and has been used successfully. The second of the techniques is the quality circle technique. And this technique is one that was originated in the US, exported to Japan, and then came back to the US. In the quality circle technique, individuals voluntarily meet on a regular basis with a group facilitator to discuss performance problems. And they isolate problems that are occurring in production. It may be too much scrappage, so there are quality control problems. It may be accidents. It may be some other kind of problem that's occurring in the organization, and suggest solutions that can be implemented. Where this has been done systematically and methodically, it's resulted in saving money for the company, and it has resulted in higher commitment on the part of employees. It's also been shown, when we look at evaluations of quality circles, that it's had simply transitory effects, and the circles have disappeared in part because they were given trivial and not substantial problems to work on. The third of these is the total quality management program. And this we're not going to go into in great detail, except to say that it is a systematic approach to systematically improve the product, the service, and the workplace. So the focus here is on customer satisfaction. It involves a focus on production quality, the quality of raw materials, and it means that you have to have a workforce that is highly involved and that is concerned with preventing errors in production and gaps in service. So it means that in terms of what you have to do to keep the workforce sustained in this kind of drive, they have to be well trained and they have to be interested in continually updating the skills. The focus is on quality. The people have to be concerned with the quality of their own performance. Again, total system alignment. Reinforce in the reward system quality of performance. And the last of these is re-engineering. We have the overhead, somebody whose job looks like it needs to be re-engineered. This is a radical redesign of the production or business process to achieve major improvements in time, cost, quality, and service. It starts out by asking the question, what business are we in? What is our main purpose? Once you figure that out, you have to see to what extent you're devoting energy to the main purpose and to what extent are you devoting energy on peripheral kinds of things that's not about the main business. And the second question is, if we're designing the organization today, how would we do it? What would it look like? It requires job redesign, often combining several tasks into one so that you get a smooth workflow. There is an emphasis on teamwork. Work is performed by the most appropriate person. So there might be people who would not normally be doing maintenance tasks doing some maintenance tasks because that would be the most appropriate person to do it. And it uses advanced information technologies. One example of some re-engineering done by Ford. The accounts payable section was huge in some parts of Ford, or probably in all parts of Ford. And it meant that there had to be a lot of people going through records, looking at invoices, checking things out, and then payments would be received. By using advanced information technologies, they were able to change things so that there was a much smaller accounts payable section. The people who worked at the loading dock were able to see through a database that was available to them if, in fact, the order coming in had been ordered and that it met the specifications and who approved it, and could issue authorization for payment on the spot. That's re-engineering. That's changing things so the person at the location, people at the loading dock, could also authorize payment for it and, in fact, have some checks cut. Much faster that way. So a big change when you're engaging in re-engineering. Where does this bring us to? How effective is all of this? Well, we find out that there is more impact on organizations, organizational outcomes, than individual outcomes. In other words, it's easier to see changes in performance of the organization than to get some changes, particularly in satisfaction, and if you're talking personal growth and development of individuals. That changes more slowly, and we're going to see why this happens in a moment. Turns out that it works better for white-collar workers and supervisory workers than it does for blue-collar. But it may be because most of it has been designed towards white-collar workers. It works better if multiple techniques are used than if a single technique is used. And it turns out that technological change shows more positive outcomes than some of the other types of changes that are used. We can then tie the last one up to the first one and begin to understand why there might be more impact on organizational outcomes, performance, productivity, than individual outcomes. It ties in with the nature of technological change often being job redesign, but usually redesign jobs because you're bringing in some new type of technology. So we're seeing the effect of technology. There are great variations across sites and organizations, and it probably has to do with the commitment of the organization. Some organizations realize change and others don't. There are very few studies that report that things get worse after the intervention. More likely, there is no change after the intervention. That's troubling. Why make the investment if nothing changed? And then you have to go back and see, was the intervention done properly? And was there commitment? Which brings us to some measurement problems. There is real difficulty in obtaining reliable measures when you're doing organizational development. And so for this reason, it's hard to get the measures. Often it goes unevaluated or under-evaluated. In other words, it's hard to get the performance measures. Sometimes there are no previous measures before the intervention. We don't know how well people were performing before. So how can we say there's a change afterwards? We just don't have good measures. And so there is an acceptance of a surrogate measure that's easy to obtain. Attitude measures. Are you more satisfied with things than the way they were before? Do you feel you're being more productive? But these are not hard measures. We really need to be much better at obtaining good performance measures throughout industry. Industry needs this in general, so we can see, in fact, if there is a change. The other reason that you tend not to get change is because of political considerations. Somebody's made a big investment in this. What if it doesn't work out? That's bad news. What's the best way to avoid bad news? Let's avoid evaluating. And let's just assume that it's working. That happens in organizations as well, which is really interesting because I started out the session by talking about how organizations look to see whether they're getting payback from the technology they invest in. Why not look to see if they're getting payback from these interventions that they're also investing in? Some other measurement problems. Usually there are a lot of changes going on when you do organizational developments. It's hard to isolate exactly what the cause is. You can find out, yeah, things improve, but what exactly is it due to? Is it due to a training program? Is it due to new technology? Is it due to putting through some new dimensions of organizational culture, getting people to focus on different things? There's also the possibility, when you do it and you find, in fact, there is improvement, that it is due to a Hawthorne effect. And now we need to go back to the very beginning of this semester and talk about expectations, that the people who are involved in all of this are caught up in this hoopla of the change, the expectancy effects that's going on, and in fact, they feel better. But that's transitory. That's not going to last. And finally, it's quite possible, and this you wouldn't know about either, that the change is just due to the passage of time. I'll give you a small example. You're doing something to try to improve employee morale, and you start with measurement in the dead of winter, and you wind up with, you do your program then, and you wind up with change, you know, the program finishes up when spring is in bloom. And you find the program works. Yeah, people's attitudes improved over time. But then you've got a control group, and you measure the control group when you didn't do anything, and you find, gee, their attitudes improved too. It may be that people are just responding to the change in seasons. Everybody feels happier when things are in bloom than in the dead of winter. An example of time passing. So it's difficult to measure, and it takes an investment to do the measures to make sure you're isolating the changes. But it's also important because you want to fine-tune your programs if you need to. Some ethical implications of what's going on. And one of the problems we get into dealing with ethical implications is so much of organizational development goes unevaluated and unsubstantiated. What this means is that it becomes a fertile area for firms out there to take advantage of unknowing organizations, to promise the world, we can turn your company around in 5 easy sessions. Be sure to pay all the money up front. And so we need to ask the question about firms who do organizational development. How ethical are they? What's their reputation? What are their references for doing things? For sure, don't ever accept anything on testimony. And if an organization is trying to push a particular solution and not one tailored to your organization, reason to be wary on all of these things. So we've got an area like other areas of life where you need to be very cautious and tread carefully to make sure that you're getting value. And all the more reason because people who trade in organizational development, unlike MDs, are not licensed in any way. So we have no real way except our own good consumer instinct and checking things out to make sure that we're getting quality. Now, there are professional organizations for people involved in organizational development, and you might want to find out if, in fact, they belong to these organizations and they follow the guidelines for organizational development professionals. That's one indicator in all of this, so that you don't find yourself somehow being swindled by somebody who talks fast and talks smoothly and is charming and is very convincing, because these people are in sales as well, that aspect of it. So the role of the organizational practitioner turns out to be very important in all of this. And you need to look at, as I said before, look at references, look at reputation, ask around, and go with a little bit of your intuition as to whether what they're saying makes sense, sounds reasonable. The other aspect to problems in ethical issues in organizational development has to do with whose values. How ethical is it to impose the values of the organization on the individual? Well, in some of the change situations that we talk about, people have a choice to join. Not everybody may go for team building. Not everybody may want to be empowered. They may find it somehow encumbering. They may find that it goes against them. Somehow it varies with their own values. On the other side, we need to think about whether workplaces are really democratic institutions after all. They're not. Okay? It's not a workplace democracy out there. Somebody's paying us to do the job. And we need to check in to see whether our values match with the organization. But they want this change. We want to stay with the organization. We can't see anything in it that is outrageously unethical. They're not asking us to shred important documents or lie or cheat or steal. They're asking us to change the way we go about doing things, to be more participatory, to change the way we do our job. And so usually we want to stay employed by that organization. We go along with the change. So as long as the values seem appropriate, then it's not really a value clash. And it's not really a democratic institution. That's not where we're working for. Even though there may be democratic principles employed in the workplace, not a democracy. It's important that the practitioners be reliable people and thoughtful people, and that they don't create more hostility than when they started. So, where have we been? We've looked at organizational values and how the process operates. We've explored major approaches and the difficulties inherent in evaluating interventions, and we also dealt with the ethical issue. At our next session, which is also our last session, we're going to deal with the global aspects of organizational behavior, managing in a global environment. Next and last time.